On June 17, 2021, a 911 call came in from an upscale suburban home in Austin, Texas. The caller, Michelle Jennings, a well-known socialite, was frantic. Her husband, Dr. Mark Jennings, had collapsed suddenly at the breakfast table. She begged for help, claiming he wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found Mark unresponsive, his coffee cup still half full on the counter. Michelle insisted it had been a heart attack, but something didn't add up. Mark had been healthy, active, and showed no prior symptoms. Routine protocol led to a toxicology test, and what it uncovered shattered the case wide open. Mark hadn't died of natural causes. There was cyanide in his system. As authorities dug deeper, the truth that emerged was far darker than anyone imagined. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about a secret so disturbing that Mark Jennings had to die for discovering it. And it had been hiding in his own home all along. When paramedics arrived at the Jennings home in Austin, Texas at 8:12 a.m. on June 17, 2021, they found Dr. Mark Jennings, 48, slumped over the breakfast table, unresponsive. His wife, Michelle Jennings, 44, stood nearby, shaking and distraught. She told them her husband had been perfectly fine moments earlier, but suddenly clutched his chest, gasped for air, and collapsed. She had called 911 immediately. The scene appeared ordinary. Mark was still in his sleepwear, his coffee cup beside him. To paramedics, it initially seemed like a sudden medical emergency, possibly cardiac arrest. Michelle's hysterical demeanor didn't raise any alarms at first. She repeated that Mark had been perfectly healthy. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but Mark was pronounced dead at the scene. As routine protocol, authorities began a standard preliminary review. Mark's body showed no external injuries, and nothing seemed immediately suspicious, except for one detail. His coffee cup was still half full. Michelle had stated that they were eating breakfast together, but when asked what he had eaten, she hesitated before saying, "Just his coffee?" He wasn't hungry. Authorities noted her response but didn't push further. Mark's body was transported for autopsy and toxicology testing. In most cases, a seemingly healthy middle-aged man dying suddenly would be attributed to a hidden cardiac condition, stroke, or aneurysm. But days later, when toxicology results came back, the case turned from suspicious to criminal. Mark Jennings hadn't died of natural causes. There was cyanide in his system. Investigators now had to determine how it got there and who put it there. To outsiders, Mark and Michelle Jennings had the kind of marriage that belonged in magazines. Mark was one of the top neurosurgeons in Texas, earning both wealth and respect in his field. Michelle was a polished socialite, known for her impeccable fashion, charity work, and hosting elegant gatherings. Together, they presented a picture-perfect life, a loving couple with 2 successful children, living in an upscale Austin neighborhood. But behind closed doors, their marriage was anything but perfect. Mark had always been a man of discipline. He worked long, grueling hours, often returning home too exhausted to engage in family life. Medicine was his priority, not his marriage. At first, Michelle accepted it. She had married a man she knew would be absent. But as the years passed, his emotional distance felt more like rejection. Michelle had been raised in privilege, accustomed to being adored and pursued. The more Mark neglected her, the more she resented him. Her life became a series of appearances, flawless on the outside, empty on the inside. While Mark was at the hospital, Michelle found solace elsewhere. At first, it was just attention from younger men, flirtations, harmless validation. But over time, her need for control, admiration, and devotion escalated, and she found it where no one expected. It started with small gestures of favoritism, giving their son, Scott, more attention than their daughter, Claire, encouraging him, flattering him, making sure he always felt like the most important man in her life. But soon, Scott became more than just her favored child. What followed would lead to the darkest betrayal imaginable. From the outside, Scott Jennings had every advantage a young man could ask for. He was raised in privilege, attending prestigious private schools, summer camps, and elite sports programs. His father, Dr. Mark Jennings, made sure Scott had the best opportunities, both academically and athletically. But what Scott wanted wasn't his father's money. He wanted his approval. From a young age, Scott knew Mark expected perfection. As a teenager, he became a star football player, a state-level quarterback with promising talent. His father was always in the stands, analyzing his performance like a surgeon assessing a patient. When Scott won, Mark would nod in approval. When he failed, he would say nothing at all. That silence stung more than words ever could. Scott spent his high school years chasing the impossible, trying to be the son his father wanted him to be. But at 17, everything changed. During the state championship game, Scott suffered a devastating ACL tear. His football career was over. The next morning, his father didn't comfort him. No sympathy, no reassurance, just cold, emotionless practicality. Scott felt like a failure. His identity, the golden athlete, the future football star, was gone. His father never spoke of football again. Instead, he poured his attention into Claire, Scott's younger sister, who had started excelling in academics. For the first time, Scott realized he was expendable. But someone did notice his pain. His mother, Michelle. At first it seemed harmless, just a mother comforting her son. Michelle had always been more affectionate with Scott than Mark ever was. While his father pushed him toward discipline and high expectations, Michelle nurtured him, reassuring him that he was enough. When Scott lost his football career, it was Michelle who told him he still had value, that he didn't need to prove anything to her. And he believed her, because for the first time in his life, someone was giving him the validation he had been chasing for years. But there was something deeper beneath Michelle's attention. It started subtly. By the time Scott turned 19, what had started as a toxic emotional attachment had turned into something much darker. They were careful at first. It happened in whispers, in moments when Mark was at work. Michelle would make excuses for them to be alone, orchestrating situations where Scott felt needed, chosen, important. And he didn't resist. He had spent his whole life trying to win someone's approval. And now, his mother, someone he had trusted unconditionally, was telling him he was the only one who truly mattered to her. The secrecy made it worse. The stolen moments, the deception, the risk. It fed Michelle's need for control and Scott's hunger for belonging. Over time, it became easier. According to Scott's words, she told him that what they had was different, that no one else would understand. She convinced him that their connection was beyond normal relationships, that they were meant for each other in a way that no one else could ever comprehend. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to hide. Claire, Scott's younger sister, started noticing the changes. There were late-night whispers, doors locked when they shouldn't have been. Claire never confronted them, but the unease settled in, a quiet warning that something was wrong. But the night it all came crashing down wasn't because of Mark's suspicions. It was because Claire, after months of uncertainty, finally told him what she had seen. And for the first time in years, Mark Jennings paid attention. Claire Jennings had never been particularly close to her mother. While Michelle adored Scott, showering him with attention and praise, Claire had always been treated as an afterthought. It never truly bothered her until she started noticing just how different things were between her mother and brother. Claire had come home from college earlier than expected. It was late, the house was quiet, and she had intended to head straight to bed. But as she passed her mother's bedroom, she heard something that made her stop. A low murmur, hushed voices, followed by a soft laugh. She knew her father wasn't home. Mark had been working late that night, which meant that the only people in that room were Michelle and Scott. According to her, she had slowly, carefully pushed the door open just a crack, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. Michelle and Scott were tangled together in bed, their movements intimate, their whispers low and affectionate. The scene was wrong in every possible way. None of them saw her. For the next few days, Claire said nothing. When Mark returned home the following evening, Claire waited until Michelle and Scott had left for an errand. Then, she told him everything. At first, he dismissed it, but Claire didn't back down. Mark was a man of logic. He needed proof. He needed to see it for himself. And soon, he would. Over the following days, Mark observed his wife and son more carefully. That moment came on a night when Michelle assumed he wouldn't be home. Mark had finished a late shift at the hospital, but decided to come back earlier than expected. As he walked upstairs, passing by the partially open door of the master bedroom, he caught sight of something that made him stop in his tracks. Inside, Scott and Michelle were together in a way no mother and son should ever be. There was no room for denial, no chance of misunderstanding. They saw him, and he saw them. For a moment, everything was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, without a word, Mark turned and walked out of the room. He didn't confront them. He didn't lash out. He simply left. Michelle and Scott didn't follow. They stayed in the room, processing what had just happened, realizing that the secret they had been hiding had just been exposed in the worst possible way. After Mark walked in on Michelle and Scott the previous night, there was no confrontation. He didn't mention what he had seen. He simply sat at the breakfast table the next morning, drinking his coffee as if nothing had happened. But Michelle was watching him. According to investigators, she had likely realized that Mark's silence was not a sign of dismissal, but a sign that he was processing what to do next. What happened next was determined through forensic evidence, phone records, and testimonies gathered later in the case. Sometime before 7:30 a.m., Michelle prepared Mark's coffee. Toxicology reports confirmed that a lethal dose of cyanide had been mixed into his cup. Cyanide is fast-acting, and depending on the dosage, death can occur within minutes. At 7:50 a.m., Mark began experiencing symptoms. Based on the 911 call, he had started coughing, struggling for breath, and within moments collapsed at the table. At 7:53 a.m., Michelle called 911, claiming her husband had suddenly stopped breathing. The call lasted just under 3 minutes. According to the recording, she told the dispatcher that Mark had been perfectly fine just minutes ago. When first responders arrived, Mark was unresponsive but still warm to the touch, indicating that his death had occurred only minutes earlier. Michelle repeated her claim that he had no health issues and had simply collapsed. Authorities found nothing immediately suspicious in the home. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no physical injuries. The cause of death was initially assumed to be cardiac-related, but routine toxicology testing performed during the autopsy changed the case entirely. Within days, results confirmed high levels of cyanide in Mark's system. The investigation had officially turned into a homicide case. Authorities reviewed the 911 call, listening carefully to Michelle's words and demeanor. She had described Mark as perfectly healthy, but claimed his death was instant and unexplained. Medical experts noted that cyanide poisoning causes a distinct progression of symptoms: labored breathing, convulsions, and loss of consciousness. Her description of how he died didn't align with the science. Detectives conducted interviews with family members and friends. Claire Jennings, Mark and Michelle's daughter, was among the first to be questioned. When asked about the state of her parents' marriage, Claire hesitated before admitting that she had witnessed something disturbing days before her father's death. At first, she refused to give details, but investigators pressed. Eventually, Claire revealed that her father had discovered something about Michelle and Scott just hours before he died. She did not elaborate, but authorities now had reason to believe that Mark's death was directly tied to that discovery. Meanwhile, forensic teams conducted a thorough search of the Jennings home. In the kitchen, they found a small, empty vial in the trash. Lab testing confirmed it contained traces of cyanide. Detectives then began piecing together Michelle's recent activities. They obtained her phone records and credit card statements. A search of her browser history revealed multiple online searches related to cyanide poisoning, including its effects and lethal dosage. Then came another major breakthrough. Scott Jennings' best friend, Josh Parkins, was questioned as part of the investigation. He revealed that Scott had been acting erratic and withdrawn in the days leading up to his father's death. But more importantly, Josh provided investigators with a crucial piece of evidence: text messages between Scott and Michelle. In one of the messages, sent 2 days before Mark's death, Michelle wrote, "We can't let him ruin everything. He needs to go." They had apparently been planning his death before he found out about them. This message, along with the toxicology report, the vial in the trash, and Michelle's online searches, gave investigators what they needed. On June 24, 2021, Michelle and Scott Jennings were arrested. Michelle was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with evidence. Scott faced second-degree murder and conspiracy charges. Authorities later confirmed that Scott had played a role in acquiring the cyanide. Security footage obtained from a local hardware store showed Scott purchasing an industrial-strength pest control chemical containing cyanide just days before the poisoning. This purchase further strengthened the case against him. At the time of their arrests, Michelle maintained her innocence. She told investigators that she had no idea how Mark ingested cyanide and that she was being framed. Scott, however, did not speak at all. He invoked his right to remain silent, refusing to answer questions without a lawyer present. By early 2022, their trial had begun. Prosecutors laid out a chilling case, a murder fueled by betrayal, deception, and a secret that Mark Jennings was never supposed to uncover. The jury listened to forensic experts explain how Mark was poisoned and watched as the prosecution presented the damning text messages between Michelle and Scott. The message where Michelle stated, "We can't let him ruin everything. He needs to go," was a key piece of evidence. Claire Jennings, Mark and Michelle's daughter, took the stand. Although she could not provide direct testimony about the murder, she confirmed that her father had caught Michelle and Scott in an intimate situation the night before he died. Her statement reinforced the motive, that Mark's discovery had led to his murder. As the case unfolded, Michelle's defense strategy shifted. She attempted to portray Scott as the sole mastermind, arguing that she had been manipulated by her son. She claimed Scott had acted alone in poisoning Mark, and that her text messages had been taken out of context. But prosecutors countered this argument by presenting Michelle's internet search history, the cyanide purchase, and testimony from close family friends who described her controlling nature and ability to manipulate Scott. After a 6-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Michelle Jennings was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Scott Jennings, though painted as a manipulated accomplice, was still found legally responsible for his father's death. He was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison. With Michelle and Scott Jennings sentenced, the case was officially closed. But for those left behind, the damage could never truly be undone. Claire Jennings, the daughter who had first warned her father, became the only surviving member of the Jennings household not behind bars. She distanced herself entirely from her mother and brother, refusing to visit them in prison or take part in any appeals. According to sources close to her, she left Texas entirely, cutting ties with the past. Scott, now serving a 35-year sentence, was placed in a medium security facility. Prison records showed that he never contested his conviction. Despite attempts from reporters to interview him, he refused to speak publicly about the case. Michelle, on the other hand, remained unapologetic. Even behind bars, she continued to claim she had been framed, shifting blame onto her son, onto Claire, even onto law enforcement. But no appeals were granted, and her life sentence remained unchanged. Mark Jennings, a respected surgeon, was buried in a private ceremony attended by colleagues, close friends, and extended family. His funeral was not attended by Michelle or Scott. Some betrayals are too deep to be forgiven. Michelle Jennings spent years weaving a lie that only ended in destruction. But in the end, the truth always comes out. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, like this video, share it, and subscribe to Unheard Crimes Corner, because the worst crimes don't just happen in the dark. They happen in places we least expect.